The Iron Bastion was not a fortress. It was a colossal, hyper-militarized insult to gravity. Suspended 3 miles above the desolate, ash-choked surface of the Earth, the Sky Prison was a brutalist monolith of black steel and glowing blue kinetic runes, held aloft by the deafening, perpetual roar of ancient anti-gravity engines. It was a place designed to warehouse the worst monstrosities the known universe had to offer, a floating tomb where the damned were sent to be forgotten. Vesper existed in the absolute bowels of this floating nightmare, a suffocating, hyper-pressurized sector known simply as the core. She was a room mechanic, a pragmatist whose hands were perpetually stained with heavy engine grease, scorch marks, and the glowing blue residue of volatile magic. She wore a heavy, scorch-proof leather apron over her utility coveralls, her dark hair tied back severely with a scrap of wire to keep it out of the sparks. She didn't concern herself with the politics of the High Wardens or the endless, bloody wars of the sovereign empires on the surface. She survived by keeping her head down, her tools sharp, and her mouth entirely shut. But her job was the most dangerous, terrifying maintenance gig in the Bastion. Suspended in the direct center of the core, housed within a massive, cylindrical stasis forge, was a prisoner known in the deepest, most restricted archives only as the Cataclysm. His true name was Zaren. He was not a man, nor was he a mere shifter. He was an ancient, biomagical world breaker, a weapon forged by dead, forgotten gods for the sole purpose of wiping planets entirely clean of life. For 1,000 years, Zaren had been locked in a catatonic sleep, his apocalyptic power suppressed by the prison's main reactor. He was a vision of terrifying, lethal majesty. He was massive, built of corded, impossibly dense muscle that seemed forged from dark, indestructible metal rather than mortal flesh. His skin was marked with deep, jagged fissures that pulsed with a faint, dying ember light, the dormant magma of his world-ending power, simmering just beneath the surface. He was suspended mid-air, his arms and legs spread wide, wrapped entirely in colossal, monolithic chains of runic iron. The chains hummed with a violent, vibrating frequency, pumping enough suppression magic into his veins to power a continent. Vesper didn't see a god. She saw a massive, terrifying machine that required meticulous, daily repair. The sheer ambient radiation of Zaren's dormant power constantly warped the runic iron, causing microscopic fractures in his heavy containment chains. Every day, Vesper climbed the towering scaffolding, her heavy hydrospanner in hand. She would endure the intense, suffocating heat radiating from his proximity, a heat that seared her skin even through her protective gear, and she would weld the glowing blue runes back together. She didn't hate him. In fact, in the oppressive, maddening silence of the core, she often found herself talking to the sleeping giant. She would mutter about her meager rations, complain about the wardens, and carefully wipe the soot from the iron resting against his collarbone. To Vesper, he was just a prisoner, asleep, trapped, and entirely helpless in the dark. That routine violently shattered on a Tuesday. Without warning, the entire Iron Bastion violently shuddered. It wasn't the usual deep rumble of the anti-gravity engines compensating for a high-altitude storm. It was a catastrophic, kinetic impact that tore through the hull. Vesper was thrown entirely off the scaffolding. She hit the grated iron floor of the core hard, the breath violently expelled from her lungs, her hydrospanner clattering loudly into the dark. The deafening, apocalyptic shriek of tearing metal echoed through the massive chamber. The Bastion's heavy anti-air cannons began to fire, a frantic, rhythmic staccato that shook the very foundations of the prison. The Sovereign Armada had arrived. They were a ruthless imperial fleet of iron-hulled dreadnoughts, and they hadn't come to destroy the prison. They had come to breach it. Their intelligence had finally located the Cataclysm. They intended to rip the sleeping god from his stasis forge and leash him to their empire's war machine, turning his apocalyptic power against their enemies. Another massive explosion rocked the Bastion, this one hitting dangerously close to the primary reactors. The low, perpetual hum of the anti-gravity engines whined, violently sputtered, and died. The impossible happened. The sky prison began to fall. The sudden, sheer G-force of the descent hit Vesper like a physical blow, momentarily pinning her to the grated floor as her stomach violently dropped. The primary lights blew out, instantly replaced by spinning red emergency strobes that bathed the core in a panicked, strobe-like blood hue. Sirens began to scream, a deafening, mechanical wail of absolute system failure. The heavy blast doors at the far end of the core hissed open, but it wasn't a rescue team. A squad of elite Bastion guards, clad in pristine silver armor, sprinted past the stasis forge. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated terror. They didn't even look at Vesper. They were abandoning the ship, scrambling for the high-altitude escape pods, leaving the low-level mechanic to burn up in the atmosphere. But the High Wardens of the Iron Bastion were not about to let the Sovereign Armada claim their ultimate prize. As the last guard fled, the heavy blast doors violently slammed shut and magnetically sealed, locking Vesper inside the falling core. A cold, synthetic female voice echoed over the screeching intercom, cutting through the chaos with chilling absolute authority. Containment breach detected. Sovereign Armada proximity critical. Bastion trajectory failing. Initiating primary failsafe. Execution protocol engaged. Purging the Cataclysm. The colossal, runic chains suspending Zaren suddenly shifted with a deafening metallic grind. The glowing blue suppression magic pulsing through the iron flared violently, instantly turning a scorching, lethal red. They weren't just holding him anymore. The automated stasis forge began to retract, the monolithic chains pulling inward with millions of tons of hydraulic pressure. The Bastion was going to violently crush the sleeping god to dust, grinding his indestructible bones into nothingness to ensure he could never be weaponized. The intense, searing heat of the execution chains instantly began to scorch Zaren's skin. Even deep within his catatonic sleep, the ancient world breaker let out a low, guttural groan of pure, unadulterated agony that vibrated through the floorboards. Vesper scrambled to her feet, wiping a streak of warm blood from her forehead where she had hit the grating. The prison was literally falling out of the sky. The Armada was currently breaching the upper hulls. The logical, pragmatic survivor in her screamed to find a maintenance hatch, pry it open, and crawl to a tertiary escape pod before the entire Bastion slammed into the earth. But as she looked up at the terrifying, apocalyptic giant suspended in the crushing forge, his body straining against the lethal red iron, something fundamental inside her snapped. He wasn't a weapon right now. He wasn't the Cataclysm. He was a prisoner being tortured and executed in his sleep by cowards who were already running away. Vesper reached down and grabbed her heavy hydrospanner from the grated floor. She gripped the massive tool until her knuckles turned stark white, her dark eyes reflecting the lethal, strobe-like red glow of the execution chains. She didn't run. She turned her back on the sealed blast doors, planted her boots on the trembling floor of the falling sky prison, and sprinted directly toward the crushing forge. The climb up the scaffolding was a brutal, agonizing fight against gravity and collapsing steel. The Iron Bastion was pitching wildly, tilting at a nauseating 45-degree angle as its massive anti-gravity engines continued to fail, sending the entire sky prison into a chaotic freefall. Vesper's heavy boots slipped on the grated iron steps, her knuckles bleeding as she hauled herself upward. The deafening, mechanical shriek of the Bastion tearing itself apart was completely overpowered by the terrifying, localized roar of the stasis forge's execution protocol. The heat radiating from the crushing chains was unimaginable. The glowing blue runes had fully transitioned into a blinding, lethal crimson, bleeding raw kinetic radiation that instantly began to singe the edges of Vesper's heavy leather apron. She threw her arm up to shield her face, her dark eyes watering from the searing ambient temperature. Suspended in the center of the retracting forge, Zaren was being slowly, methodically crushed. The monolithic iron links, each the size of a transport hauler, ground mercilessly into his magma-fissured skin. The ancient god of destruction let out another guttural, earth-shaking groan, the sound vibrating violently through the soles of Vesper's boots and rattling her very teeth. She reached the primary control node, a massive, reinforced iron console bolted to the top of the scaffolding, directly overlooking the execution chains. The console was locked down, its manual overrides magnetically sealed by the wardens before they fled. Vesper didn't have the command codes. She only had a heavy, solid steel hydro spanner and a lifetime of knowing exactly how to break things. She slammed the wedged end of the spanner into the microscopic seam of the console's casing. Gritting her teeth, she threw her entire body weight against the heavy tool, her muscles screaming in protest. The Bastion violently shuddered again as another Armada dreadnought blasted the upper hull, throwing Vesper hard against the burning metal railing. She ignored the bruising impact, ignored the blood dripping into her eyes, and desperately threw her weight against the spanner a second time. With a loud, metallic screech, the casing violently popped open. Inside the console was a chaotic, swirling maelstrom of raw, red kinetic magic. It wasn't a standard electrical circuit. It was a physical manifestation of the Bastion's execution spell, spinning like a miniature, lethal hurricane to drive the millions of tons of hydraulic pressure currently crushing the Cataclysm's ribs. Vesper raised her spanner to sever the main conduits, but the magical shielding was too dense. Her tool bounced off the kinetic barrier, sending a shower of burning red sparks across her face. A sickening, heavy crack echoed over the sirens. It was the sound of Zaren's indestructible bones finally beginning to give way under the impossible pressure. The World Breaker was going to die in his sleep, ground to dust by cowards. Vesper looked at the spinning kinetic core, her pragmatic mind making a terrifying, absolute calculation. She couldn't cut the circuit. The magic was designed to repel physical damage. The only way to stop the execution protocol was to introduce a biological, grounding wire capable of absorbing and overloading the spell's catastrophic voltage. She looked down at the sleeping, tormented god, her chest heaving as she inhaled the smell of ozone and burning iron. "I really hope you aren't the monster they say you are," she whispered. Vesper flipped her hydro spanner, gripping the uninsulated, conductive steel firmly with both bare hands. She didn't hesitate. With a feral, desperate cry, she drove the heavy tool directly into the dead center of the spinning kinetic core, throwing her entire body forward to bridge the circuit. The impact was catastrophic. A massive, lethal shockwave of raw execution magic violently ripped through the spanner and directly into Vesper's nervous system. It wasn't just electricity. It was pure, unadulterated magical voltage designed to kill a god. Her body instantly arched backward, every muscle locking in a state of absolute, agonizing paralysis. The world dissolved into a blinding, screaming white light. She could feel the kinetic radiation scorching her veins, tearing through her cellular structure, and burning the oxygen directly out of her lungs. But her desperate, suicidal gambit worked. The biological overload violently short-circuited the execution protocol. The blinding red runes pulsating across the monolithic chains suddenly flickered, spasmed, and erupted in a massive shower of blue sparks. The deafening hum of the hydraulic crushers abruptly died, the massive iron links unlocking and releasing their lethal pressure with a heavy, metallic groan. The console violently exploded, throwing Vesper backward. She flew through the air, crashing brutally against the iron scaffolding before tumbling down the grated metal stairs. She hit the floor of the core hard, the impact shattering her left collarbone and knocking the remaining breath from her lungs. Vesper lay perfectly still on the freezing iron grating, her vision swimming in and out of focus. The emergency red strobes flickered and finally died, leaving the massive chamber bathed in the dim, chaotic sparks of the ruined control node and the failing backup lights. She tasted copper and ash. Her entire body felt like it had been dipped in liquid fire, her nerves misfiring wildly from the residual magic coursing through her blood. She was broken, she was bleeding, and the Iron Bastion was still plummeting out of the sky. She closed her eyes, fully expecting the collapsing ceiling to finally crush her. But then, the atmosphere in the core violently, terrifyingly shifted. The oppressive, mechanical noise of the falling prison seemed to suddenly mute, drowned out by a new, impossible sound. It was a slow, heavy, tectonic thud, a heartbeat. Vesper forced her heavy, bloodshot eyes open, peering through the smoke and falling debris. The catatonic sleep of 1,000 years had ended. Suspended in the ruined stasis forge, Zaren's eyes slowly opened. They were not human. They were terrifying, catastrophic pools of burning, molten gold, swirling with the violent, cosmic energy of dying stars. The air pressure in the colossal chamber instantly plummeted, growing so heavy and dense with raw, apocalyptic power that it became physically difficult for Vesper to draw breath. The Cataclysm was awake. The automated execution chains were loose, but they were still wrapped tightly around his massive frame, each link weighing several tons. Zaren did not panic. He did not thrash. He simply tilted his head, the molten fissures across his dark skin flaring with a sudden, blinding internal heat. With a single, effortless, and terrifying flex of his impossibly dense muscles, the ancient runic iron that had held him captive for a millennium shattered. It didn't just break, it exploded outward like fragile glass. Thousands of tons of indestructible prison-grade metal turning into lethal shrapnel that rained down upon the floor of the core. Zaren stepped off the stasis forge. He didn't float down. He landed with an earth-shattering, heavy impact that physically buckled the solid iron grating beneath his bare feet. He stood at his full, towering height, a god of destruction fully unleashed, his corded, hypermasculine frame radiating a suffocating, lethal aura of pure kinetic heat. His ancient, apocalyptic programming should have immediately taken over. For centuries, he had been nothing but a weapon, a biomagical nuke designed to tear down the pillars of the earth and eradicate every living thing in his path. He should have immediately turned his wrath upon the falling sky prison, tearing the bastion apart atom by atom. But as the world breaker stood in the ruins of his cage, his burning, molten eyes did not look at the ceiling. They did not look at the heavy blast doors, and they did not look at the Sovereign Armada dreadnoughts currently tearing the hull apart outside. His apocalyptic gaze tracked downward, slicing through the smoke and darkness, and locked instantly onto the tiny, fragile mortal bleeding on the floor. Zaren's enhanced, predatory senses processed the scene in a fraction of a second. He smelled the heavy, metallic tang of her spilled blood. He smelled the scorching ozone of the execution magic radiating from her burnt, trembling hands. He saw the shattered control node above her. His hyperlethal, ancient mind immediately understood the absolute, undeniable truth. This fragile, insignificant human mechanic had just absorbed a lethal execution spell, shattering her own body, entirely to spare his. The apocalypse narrowed down to a single, hyper-focused point. Zaren moved. He didn't walk. He stalked forward with a slow, predatory grace that completely defied his massive size, his heavy footsteps echoing over the wailing sirens. The ambient heat in the room spiked dangerously as he approached, but it wasn't the searing, destructive radiation of the execution chains. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of living, protective warmth. Vesper stared up at the towering, terrifying god looming over her, her heart hammering weakly against her broken ribs. She couldn't move. She couldn't run. She had unleashed the end of the world, and now it was standing directly in front of her. The silence between the fragile, broken mechanic and the awakened god of destruction lasted only a fraction of a second. Zaren slowly crouched down, the massive, corded muscles of his thighs straining as he lowered his towering frame to the grated floor. The searing, ambient heat radiating from his magma-fissured skin didn't burn Vesper. Instead, it washed over her like a heavy, protective blanket, violently chasing away the freezing chill of her own failing blood pressure. He reached out, his massive, dark hand hovering mere inches from her shattered collarbone. His burning, Cosmic gold eyes mapped the exact trajectory of the execution magic that had nearly killed her. His ancient, predatory mind processed a concept he had never been programmed to understand: sacrifice. Before his fingertips could graze her skin, the heavy, magnetically sealed blast doors at the far end of the core were violently, catastrophically blown inward. The deafening explosion shattered the remaining emergency lights, filling the massive chamber with blinding plasma fire and thick, acrid smoke. The Sovereign Armada Vanguard had finally breached the lowest level. 30 elite Imperial shock troopers poured through the ruined doorway, moving with hyper-militarized precision. They were clad in heavy, dreadnought armor, wielding high-voltage suppression rifles, and carrying massive coils of synthetic, anti-magic tethers designed to leash rogue deities. They expected to find a helpless, catatonic superweapon trapped in a stasis forge, ready to be strapped to a transport hauler. Instead, the smoke cleared to reveal the shattered remains of the monolithic runic chains, and the Cataclysm standing fully awake in the center of the room. The vanguard violently halted, a collective ripple of absolute, mind-breaking terror stalling their advance. But their imperial commander, blinded by the arrogance of his empire, barked a frantic order: "Deploy the suppression nets." "He is unchained, but he is weak from the sleep. Leash the beast before he can channel." 3 heavy troopers stepped forward, firing a volley of synthetic suppression tethers directly at Zaren's massive, unarmored chest. Zaren didn't even turn his head to look at them. He didn't flinch, and he didn't dodge. He simply raised his left hand, his burning golden eyes remaining locked entirely on the bleeding woman on the floor. The heavy synthetic tethers struck his open palm and instantly, violently vaporized into a cloud of harmless gray ash. The suppression magic of the Sovereign Empire was like throwing a lit match into a raging, apocalyptic sun. Zaren slowly stood up, turning his back on Vesper to face the invading army. The protective, localized warmth he had projected around the mechanic instantly vanished, replaced by a catastrophic, suffocating shockwave of pure, unadulterated hostility. The molten fissures glowing across his dark skin flared into a blinding, searing white heat. "You bring iron to leash a god," Zaren spoke. His voice was a sound the universe had not heard in a millennium. It was not a mortal shout. It was a tectonic, heavy frequency that physically cracked the iron walls of the core, a sound that bypassed the eardrums and vibrated directly into the marrow of their bones. "But you have interrupted my quiet," he rumbled, the sheer kinetic weight of his words forcing the vanguard to take a stumbling step backward. The commander panicked. "Fire for effect. Bring him to his knees." 30 high-voltage suppression rifles erupted simultaneously, unleashing a blinding volley of plasma and anti-magic rounds. But Zaren didn't wait for the impact. He became the apocalypse. He moved with a velocity that shattered the sound barrier within the confined chamber, a blur of lethal, unstoppable kinetic force. He didn't need weapons. He didn't summon blades or shields. The World Breaker simply altered the gravitational physics of the room. With a terrifying, sweeping gesture of his hand, Zaren reversed the localized gravity directly beneath the Armada Vanguard. All 30 heavily armored shock troopers were violently ripped from the floor, screaming as they were suspended helplessly in the air, completely at the mercy of his kinetic will. Zaren walked slowly into the center of the floating, panicked army. He reached out and grabbed the commander by the throat. The heavy, dreadnought armor designed to withstand anti-air artillery buckled under his grip like wet paper. With a sickening, effortless crunch, he crushed the commander's windpipe, dropping the lifeless body to the floor. He didn't offer mercy to the rest. They had brought weapons into the room where his savior was bleeding. They were a threat, and the Cataclysm's ancient programming knew exactly how to eradicate a threat. Zaren clenched his raised fist. The altered gravity instantly collapsed inward, multiplying by a factor of 100. The remaining 29 shock troopers were violently, brutally crushed by their own heavy armor. The sickening symphony of shattering metal and breaking bone echoed over the wailing sirens of the falling prison. They dropped from the air like stones, completely and systematically annihilated in less than 20 seconds. The high-octane slaughter was breathtaking, terrifying, and absolutely absolute. Zaren stood in the center of the carnage, completely untouched, his chest heaving slightly as the kinetic energy radiated from his skin in rolling waves of heat distortion. He had been forged to destroy worlds, but in that moment, he had utilized his apocalyptic power for a singular, violently protective purpose: to clear the room. He turned his back on the ruined Imperial army and immediately returned to Vesper. The sky prison was groaning, the hull tilting further as the Bastion continued its catastrophic descent toward the Earth. Vesper was struggling to stay conscious, her vision darkening at the edges, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Zaren dropped to his knees beside her. The lethal, world-ending monster vanished, instantly replaced by a creature of terrifying, obsessive devotion. He carefully, impossibly gently, slid his massive arms beneath her broken body. He didn't treat her like a fragile mortal. He treated her like the single, most vital artifact in the known universe. "You are failing," Zaren murmured, his tectonic voice dropping to a low, desperate rumble. He pressed his massive, burning palm against the center of her chest, directly over her erratic heartbeat. He didn't use kinetic destruction this time. He inverted his magic. The raw, ancient energy of the Cataclysm flowed from his skin into hers, a brilliant, warm golden light that bypassed her shattered collarbone and flooded her failing nervous system. It wasn't medical healing. It was biological stabilization through pure, brute force magical infusion. Vesper gasped, her back arching slightly as the agonizing pain of the execution shock was violently overwritten by the sheer, vibrant power of the World-Breaker's life force. Her dark eyes snapped open, locking onto his burning, molten gaze. "You broke the chains of the world," Zaren whispered, his face hovering mere inches from hers, completely ignoring the chaotic sounds of the prison tearing itself apart around them. "You bled to spare a monster you were taught to fear. My programming demands the destruction of this planet. It demands ash and silence." He gently brushed a soot-stained lock of hair from her pale forehead, his touch as light as a feather despite the monstrous strength behind it. "But I look at you," Zaren vowed, his golden eyes flaring with an unbreakable, eternal claim, "and I find that I no longer want to end the world. I only want to keep you in it. You are my tether, little mechanic. And the Cataclysm belongs entirely to you." The Iron Bastion had finally reached its terminal velocity. The colossal, hyper-militarized sky prison was tearing itself apart piece by piece, the deafening shriek of shearing metal completely drowning out the wailing emergency sirens. Massive iron support beams snapped like dry twigs, and entire upper sectors of the facility were violently ripping away, sucked into the freezing, chaotic slipstream of the atmosphere. The heavy grated floor beneath them was pitching at a near-vertical angle, the gravity plating completely failing as the primary reactors went critical. But inside the shattered, smoke-filled ruins of the core, Vesper felt absolutely no gravity at all. Zaren held her effortlessly against his massive, unarmored chest. He cradled her broken body with a terrifying, absolute care, his thick, corded arms forming an impenetrable physical barrier against the falling debris. The agonizing burn of the execution magic that had nearly stopped her heart was entirely gone, replaced by the heavy, vibrating warmth of the World-Breaker's own life force pumping through her veins. Vesper looked up at his rugged, magma-fissured face, watching the molten gold of his eyes burn with a fierce, unwavering focus. He wasn't looking at the collapsing ceiling. He wasn't panicking. The apocalypse did not fear the end of the world. He orchestrated it. "Hold your breath," Zaren commanded, his tectonic voice slicing cleanly through the deafening roar of the dying prison. He didn't look for a maintenance hatch. He didn't search for the high-altitude escape pods that the cowardly wardens had already taken. The Cataclysm was his own extraction. Zaren turned toward the thick, heavily reinforced exterior bulkhead of the Bastion, a wall of solid iron and kinetic shielding designed to withstand direct orbital bombardment. He didn't even raise his hand. He simply glared at the steel and forcefully exhaled. A localized, catastrophic shockwave of pure kinetic force erupted from his body. The impenetrable bulkhead didn't just break, it violently atomized. A massive, gaping hole was instantly blown cleanly through the side of the plummeting sky prison, revealing the chaotic, bruised sky outside. The sudden, violent decompression threatened to suck the remaining oxygen from the room, but Zaren's ambient magical aura instantly formed a pressurized, breathable cocoon around Vesper. Without a single moment of hesitation, the ancient god stepped out of the ruined core and directly into the open, howling void of the sky. Vesper gasped, burying her face into his chest as they fell into the freezing slipstream. But the freefall only lasted a fraction of a second. Zaren's back arched, and with a blinding, searing eruption of light, massive wings of pure, shifting kinetic gold violently manifested from his shoulder blades. They were not made of feathers or flesh. They were constructed of raw, highly concentrated magical energy, burning with the intensity of a dying sun. With a single, devastating flap that visibly warped the air pressure around them, Zaren halted their descent entirely. He hovered in the center of the sky, a brilliant, terrifying star suspended against the gray, ash-choked clouds. Below them, the shattered remains of the Iron Bastion plummeted toward the earth, a massive, burning meteor of iron and failure. But the sky surrounding them was far from empty. They were hovering directly in the center of the Sovereign Armada's invasion fleet. Hundreds of massive, iron-hulled dreadnoughts and heavily armed gunships swarmed the airspace, their thrusters burning bright blue against the smog. The Imperial fleet immediately noticed the blinding golden anomaly hovering in the wreckage. Warning klaxons echoed across the Armada. The massive, heavy artillery cannons of the dreadnoughts slowly began to pivot, locking their targeting lasers directly onto Zaren. The Imperial commanders, realizing that the ultimate weapon had not only survived the Bastion's failsafe, but was now completely unchained, prepared to bring him down with overwhelming force. Target locked. Fire all batteries. A distorted Imperial transmission crackled over the open frequency, loud enough for Vesper to hear over the rushing wind. Thousands of heavy plasma rounds and anti-magic artillery shells erupted from the fleet simultaneously. The sky was instantly painted in a blinding, terrifying crossfire of lethal, high-voltage destruction, all of it converging on the singular point where Zaren hovered. Vesper squeezed her eyes shut, instinctively bracing for the impact. The impact never came. Zaren did not dodge. He simply raised his free hand, his fingers spreading wide. The barrage of thousands of artillery shells violently halted in midair, suspended merely 10 feet away from them, frozen entirely in place by a wall of absolute, insurmountable kinetic suppression. The World Breaker didn't even flinch. He looked out at the massive dreadnoughts that had dared to fire upon him while he was holding his mate. His molten golden eyes flared with a catastrophic, unadulterated rage. They brought war to the sky, Zaren rumbled, the sound vibrating through the very atmosphere, causing the clouds to violently part. I will give them the ash they so desperately crave. Zaren slowly closed his raised hand into a tight, crushing fist. The suspended artillery shells didn't just drop. They were violently reflected backward at 10 times their original velocity. But that was only the beginning. Zaren threw his arm outward, completely unleashing the apocalyptic protocol that had been dormant inside his blood for a millennium. A massive, expanding halo of devastating kinetic force exploded from his body. It was a world-ending shockwave, a brilliant, blinding ring of catastrophic golden energy that sliced through the sky at supersonic speed. When the shockwave hit the Sovereign Armada, the destruction was absolute. The heavy, impenetrable iron hulls of the dreadnoughts buckled and crumpled as if they were made of tinfoil. Massive engines detonated in sequence, chaining together in a breathtaking, high-octane symphony of pure cinematic annihilation. Gunships were swatted from the air like insects, vaporizing into clouds of molten slag and falling ash. The Cataclysm did not fight the fleet. He simply erased it. In less than 10 seconds, the entire Imperial Armada, a military force capable of conquering continents, was systematically and utterly wiped from the sky. The heavens were entirely quiet once more, save for the gentle hum of Zaren's kinetic wings and the soft falling of burning debris. Zaren slowly descended through the clouds, drifting effortlessly toward the desolate surface of the earth below. They touched down in the center of a sprawling, ash-covered wasteland. The impact was entirely silent, his magic absorbing the shock to ensure Vesper wasn't jostled. He allowed his massive, golden wings to dissolve back into the ether, the blinding light fading into the quiet, gray afternoon. The remnants of the Iron Bastion and the Armada rained down miles away, harmless shooting stars marking the end of an era. Zaren did not set her down. He stood in the quiet wasteland, holding the soot-stained mechanic against his chest. He looked down at her, his expression a terrifying, beautiful blend of ancient lethality and absolute, possessive devotion. The world breaker who had been forged to wipe the planet clean had finally found the one thing he refused to destroy. "The prison is gone," Zaren whispered, his heavy thumb gently brushing the grease and soot from her cheek. "The empires of men are ash. My programming told me that the mortal realm was a disease that required purging. But you bled for a monster, Vesper. You shattered my chains with your own pulse." He leaned down, resting his forehead gently against hers, completely enveloping her in his impossible, comforting heat. "I will not break this world," the Cataclysm vowed, his golden eyes burning with a dark, eternal promise. "But I will not allow you to scrape by in the shadows of it any longer. Where you walk, the earth will yield. What you desire, I will take. I will not destroy this world, little mechanic. I am going to conquer it for you. But what do you think? Was Vesper right to risk her life to stop the execution of a world breaker? Or did she unknowingly unleash a terrifying new dictator upon the mortal realm? Did Zaren take his apocalyptic instincts too far by vaporizing an entire Imperial fleet? Or is that exactly the kind of unapologetic, high-octane protection a true Queen of the Ashes deserves? Is there a line between a monstrous claim and true devotion when the weapon meant to end the world decides to fall in love instead? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you love this epic tale of cinematic fantasy, a pragmatic survivor, and a completely obsessed, world-ending god who refuses to let anyone hurt her, please smash that like button and share this video with your fellow Romantasy fans. And if you want to find out how Vesper and Zaren navigate conquering the ashes of the old world together, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next epic tale.